Well, hello, everyone, and thank you for attending today's keynote plenary panel on energy efficiency as a resource for filling the gap between state and local climate goals and current trends. I'm Bill Prindle. I'm a proud ACEEE alum, and I'm now a vice president at ICF, and I'll be our moderator for this panel. But before we get to our panel and the conversation we hope to get into, a few housekeeping items. First and foremost, thank you to our sponsors and our ACEEE Ally program members for their support of the conference and of ACEEE. As attendees, you will be in listen-only mode. This is where we all wish we were in person, isn't it? But here we are. So please use the chat box, which is on the right side of your screen, to post questions, and I'll track those and bring them to the panelists as we get into the Q&A session, so feel free to post at any time. We are scheduled for 1 hour. We do have an additional 15-minute, I'll call it coffee break time at the end of that hour. So those who want to stay are welcome to do so. If there is reason for further conversation, we'll see how that goes. As a way of framing our panelists' remarks, I wanted to provide a few reflections here at the outset. So this session came to be because a number of states and cities have gone deep into climate and clean energy action. And many of them are struggling to show the progress that they need to show to meet these ambitious carbon neutrality, 80% reduction goals that you see in these in climate plans. So, for example, Governor Pritzker in Illinois announced a new renewable power goal and immediately got hit with a wave of press that said, well, you didn't meet the last one by half, and how are you going to meet this one? And just in the last week or two, the CEO of Southern Cal Edison has called out state leaders to put the pedal to the metal and really speed things up, because the utility can only do so much on its own. And I must point out that the UN Conference of Parties in Glasgow starts in 5 days. And there's a chorus of voices, including UN Secretary General Guterres, saying we have to accelerate the pace of climate action. We're just not moving the needle fast enough. So that's the big picture. The question then is, where does that acceleration and progress come from? And there are a lot of fronts here. This is a big many-piece puzzle, but energy efficiency is known to be cost-effective. It's known to be rapid to deploy, and it's pretty much available anywhere where there's electricity and fuel end use. So efficiency can serve as a core resource to make the clean energy transition happen faster in any jurisdiction, and especially in the next 5 to 10 years. So today we'll hear from leaders in 3 states and 1 major city on their stories and how to tap energy efficiency as a cornerstone in their policy and program strategies. And as I look at these issues that I find my clients grappling with today, I can't help reflecting a bit on the historical arc that I've been through in my own career. So I came to Washington to work late in the Carter administration because, well, that's where the action was and that's where the jobs were. Congress in the 70s passed all kinds of foundational energy policy elements that we are still building on today. And then during the 1980s, the state energy program came into being. And that's been helping to fund 2 of our panelists, Dave and Glenn, their offices. But in the last 20 years, as I've seen it, progress on the federal front has really slowed down, if not stalled. There were some progress made in the 2005 and 2007 energy bills, and we have great programs like Energy Star and Better Buildings. But really, when you look at the whole spectrum, most of the action we're seeing on the ground is coming from state and local efforts. So that's really where things are happening. And just as a personal snapshot, so back in those days, I did a little pro bono consulting for the city of New York for the Mayor Ed Koch incoming administration. That's how long I've been in this business. And there was so little data on energy use. There were no personal computers. There were no modeling tools. There were only a couple of things you could do for efficiency, things like removing light fixtures and turning down thermostats. And there was no program infrastructure for actually delivering efficiency to the market. So flash forward 40 years, in the Pathways to Carbon Neutral NYC study, my firm was part of that. We were able to use the city's local law 84 benchmarking data to support the modeling work. We had powerful computer simulation tools. We had hundreds of efficiency measures to model, and the city has its accelerator program, and there are utility programs in place. So there's infrastructure. So there's a huge amount of progress that's been made that I think state and local governments can leverage. So we've seen shifts happen. We have data, we have analytics tools, we have technology solutions, and we have delivery infrastructure. So it's arguable that efficiency could play a big role. So I just frame the question to our panel like this. So like it or not, you are at the front of the wave of clean energy action. So how do you see energy efficiency as a resource as you try to drive more progress in reaching your climate goals? So that's kind of how I would frame this. I want to do some quick intros of our panelists, and this will be in the order they'll be giving their opening remarks. And their bios are in the conference materials on the website, so I won't reread that. But just briefly, we're going to start off with Senator Jennifer McClellan, who's a climate action hero in the Virginia State Senate. Her leadership in forming and passing the Virginia Clean Economy Act in 2020 has been widely recognized, right up there with her record on healthcare and justice and voting rights and women's issues. And among other distinctions, she has been a key force in raising Virginia's ACEEE State Energy Scorecard ranking in recent years. Second up, we have Dave Althoff, who leads the Pennsylvania Energy Programs Office. Dave has almost 30 years experience in the Commonwealth's energy policy and program arena. He's also a national leader through his service on the DOE State Energy Advisory Board and the NASIO Board. And he's also been through several rounds of state climate action planning, of which I've been privileged to be part of the last couple of rounds. Third on the docket, we have Elizabeth Kelly. Elizabeth is a senior policy advisor in the New York City Mayor's Office of Climate and Sustainability, where she leads several efforts to help the city achieve its 2050 carbon neutrality goal. And I got to know a little bit about that through the Pathways to Carbon Neutral NYC study, came out in April. One program she oversees is the NYC Accelerator, which makes the city one of the few local governments that actually has a delivery program of its own. We might hear more about that. And fourth, we have batting cleanup, I guess we'd say, given it's World Series week. Glenn Blackman leads the Energy Policy Office at the Washington State Department of Commerce. And he was also Director of Regulatory Services at the Utility Commission and was also on staff in the Legislative Senate Energy and Utilities Committee. So he brings a rich balance of legislative and regulatory as well as program experience to the panel. And I do remember Governor Inslee as a tireless advocate for clean energy when he was a congressman. So I'm not surprised that Glenn's office is pretty busy these days. So that is our panel, and I am going to turn the mic to Senator McClellan.
Well, thank you for having me this morning. Thank you to all of the conference attendees. I am Senator Jennifer McClellan. I represent the Metro Richmond area in Virginia. I have been in our state legislature for going on 16 years now. And for me, energy efficiency, my energy efficiency journey really began as a kid. And Bill, it's good to hear you talking about your work in the Carter administration, because I'm a member of Gen X. And so I remember Saturday mornings during the energy crisis of the 1970s watching Schoolhouse Rock. And I remember the Energy Blues episode that began, for those that may be too young to remember, with our planet Earth singing energy. Sometimes I think I'm running out of energy. Seems like we use an awful lot of energy for heating and lighting and driving, reading and writing and jiving. Energy, you think we'd be saving it up. So as a kid, I used to worry about, are we going to deplete our natural resources, and what does that mean? And began in my own childlike way to focus on conservation. As a parent now to two kids, a 11-year-old and a 6-year-old, I worry about the world we'll leave our children, not only through the depletion of our natural resources, but through climate change, and wanting to do everything that I can to mitigate both. And as a legislator, I have seen and been proud of the giant leaps we've made here in the Commonwealth of Virginia over the past 20 years, especially in the last two. So before I got elected back in 2001, Virginia created an energy efficiency and performing contracting support program. But we were unable to get really any legislation to address energy efficiency or much of anything beyond traditional coal and natural gas energy production and policy. But through that program, our state agencies, our higher ed facilities, and other public bodies entered into contracts with energy service companies to significantly reduce our energy costs through conservation and operational matters. I am proud to say that earlier this month, Governor Ralph Northam announced that the Virginia program has saved over $1 billion in energy costs since it was created, and Virginia has become only the second state to reach that milestone. So we began very slowly addressing energy efficiency here, but we took a giant leap. And I use that metaphor intentionally because we passed in 2020 the Virginia Clean Economy Act, which I was proud to champion in the Senate with my colleague Rick Sullivan in the House. And when the Clean Economy Act passed, I literally wanted to jump out of the seat and shout, "The eagle has landed," because it was that transformative and that big a deal in the Commonwealth. It is legislation that made Virginia the first state in the South and one of only a handful in the country to have 100% clean energy standard. But it did that by addressing both supply and demand, which I'll come back to in a minute. It was the culmination of over a year's worth of work. We flipped both the House and the Senate in 2020, and we were able to have a clean energy majority. And so in the year leading up to that, we put together a coalition of environmental advocates, clean energy industry members and advocates, energy efficiency advocates, and public health experts, and built this plan to get to 100% clean energy by 2050 using 4 key pillars. One was to establish a renewable portfolio standard where our 2 electric utilities, Dominion would be 100% carbon-free by 2045 and Appalachian Power by 2050. And all of their coal-fired power plants and natural gas plants will be closed by those benchmarks. It advances offshore wind by declaring 5,200 megawatts of offshore wind to be in the public interest, and really has now set Virginia as a leader in offshore wind on the East Coast. It advanced solar and both rooftop and utility scale solar. But most importantly, on the demand side, it established energy efficiency standards by declaring an energy efficiency pilot program that we had set up a few years earlier to be in the public interest. It required that new program to reduce the energy burden for low-income customers and required our Department of Social Services and Housing and Community Development to convene a stakeholder group to implement the program, but it also set specific energy efficiency standards for our electric companies with penalties if they don't meet them. And so this has really jump-started us going forward. The second thing we did in 2020 was we passed legislation to join the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative and earmarked half of Virginia's RGGI revenues through the cap and trade auctions to be allocated towards low income and energy efficiency programs to help not only reduce the cost to our lower income families, but more importantly, to manage demand. Because we understood if we were going to get to 100% clean energy, you could not do that all on the supply side. You had to, at the same time, manage demand. And energy efficiency is the most cost-effective way to do that. And so very proud of the work that we have done. It has now been a little over a year since the act took effect. We are already starting to see the impacts of it. We know we have a way to go to make sure that it is implemented the way that we intended it to, but very excited about the progress that we made in just 1 year. Because again, when I first got elected to the House, we could not get very much passed on energy efficiency or clean energy through the House, but we were persistent. And once we were able to put this coalition together, our utility companies, they weren't crazy about the bill when it was first introduced. They looked to kill the bill, but they very quickly realized that this bill was going to pass and that they needed to have a seat at the table and be part of the solution and not just block it. So just a really good example of how persistence pays off. And now I feel a little bit better that my children won't be singing the same energy blues that I was singing on Saturday mornings in the 70s.
Okay, I guess that means I'm up next. I'm Dave Altoff, and I'm a Gen Xer as well, so I remember very, very clearly Schoolhouse Rocks, and I always thought the best one was I'm only a bill, and I'm sitting here on Capitol Hill. So we know that infrastructure bill's out there sitting on Capitol Hill, so we're looking forward to that to help what we need to do with regards to energy and climate. So I'm the director of the Energy Programs Office here at the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection. So good afternoon to you from Harrisburg, PA, which is where I'm at currently. And I want to hit on sort of 3 points here, which is energy and climate planning. What can we do? What are some challenges going forward? And as Bill mentioned, I'm the director of the State Energy Office. So ultimately, that office within the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection has a mission. I want to read that mission to you because I think it's instructive. It says, we will work as partners with individuals, organizations, governments, and businesses to achieve a balance in the energy sector for deploying energy technologies that prevent pollution, protect our natural resources while assuring affordable and abundant energy resources for Pennsylvania that support economic growth. And now that's a solid mission statement. But I think our mission has really changed recently. And our mission changed specifically when Governor Tom Wolf in 2019 came out and said, climate change is the most critical environmental threat confronting the world. Given the urgency of the climate crisis facing Pennsylvania and the entire planet, the Commonwealth must continue to take concrete, economically sound, and immediate steps to reduce emissions. And that really caused us to look at our mission in the Energy Programs Office, because interestingly, we are not only the State Energy Office, we are also the Climate Office for the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. We are charged with providing every 3 years a climate impacts assessment and a climate action plan. And as it turns out, that climate action plan is driving everything that we do in the Energy Office, because in Pennsylvania, over 80%, more like 85% of our greenhouse gas emission impacts really come from energy acquisition, distribution, transmission, and use. And so in reality, these challenges, the challenges of getting to 80% reduction in greenhouse gases by 2050 is really on the backs of the energy program, and is really on how do we then talk to our constituency? How do we highlight things for them to do? What can they do? How to plan to adapt? And isn't mitigation a form of adaptation anyhow? And what we've seen is you can't undo the heat wave. You can't undo the flood. And I think ultimately, our office is aiming our shared mission now towards, in this order, climate, conservation and efficiency, advanced energy technologies, energy security and resiliency, and education and outreach, really in that order. And so, what can we do? Our office is really working today to provide opportunities to optimize an energy resource or energy using system such that it adds value to the environment, the economy, resiliency, and our energy resource sustainability. Because we're going to continue to need energy. We're going to continue to use energy. It's just how do we acquire it, and what are we doing with it along the way such that we can minimize our infrastructure needs. So, in the past, our program is really focused on things that provide opportunities for our constituency, whereby they feel like they're providing themselves with an economic benefit. They're becoming more resilient. They're becoming more modern. And we focused on, energy efficiency assessments at local governments and manufacturers and small businesses. And we've tried to provide, grants and incentive opportunities to, replace motors and do weatherization. We've provided support for building energy codes officials and training to make sure that we are meeting, energy codes such that our buildings are becoming more sustainable and resilient. We have revolving loan funds for commercial building energy efficiency. But that's really, while those are nice programs, they're not really getting to the sort of the cradle to grave piece of energy efficiency. And so we started looking at agricultural energy efficiency. Folks, when you go to a restaurant, and sometimes it's a farm to table restaurant, right? That means something to somebody. Well, what is farm to table relative to food and food processing and another, need that we all have? And so how does that whole system become more efficient? We've started to focus more on energy efficiency workforce development. How do we make sure that folks are not only implementing energy efficiency at home, at their workplace, what they're doing on the weekend, but that it becomes actually part of their job, that there are jobs involved with energy efficiency. And so we've sort of taken these impacts, the climate impacts assessment, the climate action planning, and taken it to the next level and started to look from beginning to end with regards to energy efficiency and be able to discuss it in those terms. I mean, we think that folks are very much in tune with the impacts of climate these days. I mean, I even have a prop here. Like, we are all very much aware of a crisis that we are having that affects all of us and affects us individually as well. The climate crisis is not that much different. And there's lots of things that we can do. While we model strategies in our climate action plan, and we model 15 or 18 strategies to show that it's possible to have a pathway to get to 80% by 2050 or 100% of greenhouse gas emission reductions, it's really about the hundreds or thousands of things that we can do collectively, individually, at work and at play. And I think when you start to think about those hundred or thousands of things, a lot of those are energy efficiency and energy conservation. It's what we can really relate to. The last thing I'll mention is that while I think we can measure those things, and Bill is correct, we've come a long way with regards to building benchmarking, and you can't reduce what you can't measure. And those are principles we should not leave out. But I think it's also important for us to connect energy efficiency and to connect these projects to really the climate change. And how can we look at these projects and look at these opportunities and say, well, we're doing things that improve public health. We're doing things to improve overburdened communities. That we're doing things to improve environmental justice and equity, especially to our built infrastructure, which is seeing the impacts from climate. And I think we need to discuss the benefits of energy efficiency in the terms of age and underlying health conditions and limited access to adapt. How do we make homes more resilient? How do we make our living spaces more resilient? I think we solved that with regards to the issues in Texas. And really, everybody's at home and everybody needs to rely on at-home activities and their living space and make them more resilient to the impacts from climate change. A lot of times that is energy efficiency, and it's how can I be more energy efficient at home? So I'll wind up with that I believe that there's really a need to measure and value energy efficiency in the ways that we talk about the environment, the economy, resiliency, and energy resource sustainability, and how it connects to climate. And we need to use terms and measures that resonate with communities. We have communities that are really interested now in climate action planning, and it's because they see the impacts. And what we need to do is help them identify that energy efficiency is still there. There's still more to do. You may have changed out all of your light bulbs to LEDs, but there's more to do. And these measures relative to how it's improving your environment, how it can improve your economy, how it can make you more resilient, need to be part of the discussion when we talk about deployment of energy efficiency. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Kelly, a senior policy advisor at the New York City Mayor's Office of Climate and Sustainability. Our team works across a number of sectors and citywide to promote decarbonization, energy efficiency, and clean and renewable energy investments in New York City. And to frame this conversation, I want to talk a little bit about the past, present, and future of energy efficiency policy and programs in New York City. So starting about a decade ago, a little bit more than that now, but New York City passed a bunch of landmark legislation from Local Law 84, which required energy and water disclosure or benchmarking, energy audits and retro-commissioning, sub-metering requirements for large building. All of this work together has given New York City, as Bill mentioned, 10 plus years of insight into energy use intensity and performance, as well as a pretty substantial equipment inventory of our New York City's buildings, information on system efficiency, age of equipment, and all of this data together has been fundamental in helping New York City shape new and future policies and programs for the built environment. In New York, about 68% of all of our emissions come from buildings. And so all of our work, I mean, not all of our work, but a sizable amount of our work has really focused on driving energy efficiency and decarbonization strategies in the built environment. These early commitments in legislation around data disclosure and energy auditing made the way for our commitment to carbon neutrality for New York City by 2050, as well as our zero carbon operating emissions pledge for new construction buildings by 2030. And more recently, in 2019, New York City Council passed the Climate Mobilization Act, which was a suite of legislation and activities to support this commitment to carbon neutrality by 2050. And it included requirements for solar on new roofs and renovated new roofs, energy letter grades posted in lobby windows to promote awareness around energy use intensity and transparency for New Yorkers about the energy conditions and energy performance in buildings, multifamily, commercial, industrial, and bring more attention to what's going on behind the meter for renters, buyers, brokers, tourists, and anybody passing by who sees a letter grade from A to D, indicating the energy use intensity and performance of that property. And then last but not least, we also passed Local Law 97 is part of the Climate Mobilization Act. And maybe some of you are familiar with this, but this legislation requires buildings over 25,000 square feet to meet greenhouse gas emission limits or budgets starting in 2024 or face financial penalties and fines. There's about 50,000 buildings in New York City that will need to comply with Local Law 97, and about 20% of those buildings will need to take action to reduce emissions by investing in energy efficiency before 2024, and then about 75% of those buildings will need to act prior to the deadline of 2030. And furthermore, to support these policy goals and objectives, we've also launched commercial property assessed clean energy financing, or CPACE, for multifamily and commercial buildings. The program just kicked off in May of this year, and we've already closed over $100 million in loans, which was staggering and record-breaking and kind of shocking for all of us on the program side. But we're really excited about the energy and enthusiasm of both the PACE lender and PACE borrower market in New York City. And we'll soon, probably the end of this year or early next year, be expanding the PACE program to support also financing for new construction projects that have no on-site fossil fuel generation. We've also, as Bill mentioned just a few minutes ago, we run a program called NYC Accelerator, which is a technical assistance program aimed to mobilize New Yorkers through this very aggressive market transformation that we intend and we are committed to as a city. We start with energy efficiency first, always, and focus on reducing fossil fuel dependence throughout New York City's privately owned 1 million buildings. The real focus of the accelerator program is first awareness and getting the message out through marketing and outreach events about the city's commitments. What does energy efficiency mean? What does this look like in your building? As well as some direct data-driven targeting and outreach to identify high need properties or high energy intensive properties, and earmark them for direct technical assistance and support. So that's kind of a recap of what's happening in New York City right now. But for framing and context, I want to highlight two other items. One is the passage of the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, or the CLCPA, which was enacted by New York State legislators in 2019 and committed New York State to 85% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 and 100% zero emission electricity by 2040. The CLCPA forecasts about 22 million tons of carbon reduction will happen through energy efficiency and electrification. So both the city and the state are really banking and looking to energy efficiency as a strategy to meet both the carbon neutrality goals of New York City as well as the commitments of the CLCPA. In New York, we have it's hard to talk about energy efficiency without talking about energy supply and emission factors of our grid. New York City, just for context, New York City uses about the same amount of electricity as the entire state of Massachusetts, but Massachusetts has 35 times the amount of space than New York City. So most of the renewable energy that's generated in the state, in New York State, is sited upstate, where there's lots of space to build it, but then there's constraints on our transmission system that prevent much of that energy from reaching New York City, meaning that we currently are relying on old polluting power plants located throughout the 5 boroughs to provide electricity to our buildings and operations. So building more distributed generation on rooftops throughout the city, interconnecting large amounts of offshore wind, and advocating at the state level to build more transmission lines to bring clean power from upstate to New York City will be critical for overcoming this challenge and making sure that as we reduce with energy efficiency, then move to electrification, there is clean and zero emission electricity supplied to New York City. And these state commitments are extremely important to New York City. While we do regulate our building and energy codes, we can and have enacted laws to restrict fossil fuel and encourage energy efficiency and beneficial electrification. But the course is set by the state for developing renewables and clean energy, and that's really intrinsic to how New York City approaches its climate action planning. The CLCPA and related state and initiatives also send clear signals to the market, developers, manufacturers, utility companies, power producers about the role of electricity in the coming century. And we see consistent signaling from both the city and the state as invaluable components to the market transformation that we're pushing for in New York. And lastly, another thing that Bill already mentioned, but this spring we completed a carbon neutral NYC. It's a joint study with our utilities and the city of New York, which developed pathways for how the city can meet its decarbonization goals. And the study found that for NYC to reach carbon neutrality, over 90% of our 1 million buildings must undergo some level of energy efficiency retrofits by 2050. So we're looking at about 28,000 buildings undergoing an energy efficiency retrofit every single year, with a goal of energy efficiency retrofits reducing energy consumption in buildings by 50% by 2050. Again, critical for meeting that carbon neutrality goal. In order for this to work, we need to scale energy efficiency right now. It's technology that exists. There's people who know how to do it. And I see my role as really promoting that awareness, working with the market to provide the right types of training and workforce development, manufacturing and technology to support this transition, which is kind of a win-win from both a climate perspective, but also from a recovery perspective and a resiliency angle for the city. We see energy efficiency as a large driver of an inclusive economic opportunity, creating new businesses and numerous job opportunities throughout New York City. So it's an exciting time.
Hi, I'm Glenn Blackman from the state of Washington Energy Office, and I work on both climate and energy policy here, and I'm looking forward today to talk about the intersection of those and how that affects energy efficiency potential and programs. Energy efficiency has been an important part of Washington's energy resources since the 80s. Maybe not a coincidence from that song that the senator was talking about before in the 70s, but it really has been important as a tool to meet resource requirements in the Northwest for a long time. I think you already last week heard the Northwest brag about how much we've accomplished with energy efficiency, so I'll skip that for now. But I will say that we carried that over in the climate context when we adopted a renewable portfolio standard in 2006. It was part of that law was an energy efficiency resource standard that requires that the electric utilities identify and acquire all cost-effective energy efficiency measures. And then in 2019, when we adopted a 100% clean electricity law, we once again embedded in that a requirement that the utilities acquire all the available cost-effective energy efficiency alongside the renewables. We also have required that the electric and gas utilities evaluate energy efficiency measures, including the societal cost of greenhouse gas emissions, something that we would expect to increase the amount of energy efficiency that's cost effective, at least as long as we're using fossil fuels to generate the electricity. However, we have seen in our planning a shift in emphasis away from energy efficiency as our electricity resource mix has changed to meet these clean electricity requirements. And as we shift from avoiding construction of power plants to reducing emissions, with a cleaner mix of generating resources, there's fewer emissions to be avoided with an efficiency measure. And then with high levels of renewable generation in our mix, we anticipate wholesale electricity prices will be lower, and that drives the cost effectiveness calculations down for electric efficiency. We're seeing this result play out right now in our regional power plan that the Northwest Power Planning Council produces. In their draft plan, they have proposed an efficiency target that's about a third to almost a half lower than what they did 5 years ago. It would produce an annual acquisition rate of under 1% of electricity load. And, we realize there may be sound reasons for reducing the EE potential in the electricity sector, but I would have to say we're not convinced about that result. And we have some concern that as our power system is being transformed in really significant ways, that we're not necessarily capturing the full value of energy efficiency in that. We're seeing this spot market effect on energy efficiency cost effectiveness, but meanwhile, all the new renewables drive up the need for capacity resources. In our region, capacity has never been a big focus in energy planning, and we think maybe some more attention needs to be paid to that element of the planning before we decide that we should really reduce the EE targets. And I want to be clear that this is just kind of within the silo of electricity end uses, where our electricity planners are looking at the potential for efficiency with existing end uses of electricity and finding a smaller quantity of efficiency potential. Because meanwhile, we're engaged in more comprehensive energy modeling, where we look at energy use across the entire economy with the objective of finding the best paths to reduce overall greenhouse gas emissions and energy use. We've heard others on this panel talk about the same type of work. We used this approach when we developed our 2021 state energy strategy. And in that context, we found that there was plenty of opportunity not only to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but also to increase overall energy efficiency across all fuel types. In our electrification scenario, we found that by 2040, the overall energy demand would be 24% lower than in the reference case. And by 2050, with electrification, we'd see a 33% lower total energy use than in the reference case. And this is, producing the same level of energy services, but just doing it much more efficiently. This form of energy efficiency is not just within the silos. It's not just replacing an electric furnace with a high efficiency electric heat pump. It's replacing a gas furnace or a gas water heater with a high efficiency electric heat pump equipment. And probably the biggest one of all is replacing internal combustion gasoline and diesel vehicles with battery electric vehicles. We see a lot of energy efficiency in that transformation of our transportation sector. The other thing that we see as a result of this climate policy work is new questions about energy efficiency in the natural gas sector. I mentioned earlier that we do require cost effectiveness and acquiring all available energy efficiency. That applies to the gas companies as well, and they're required to incorporate the social cost of greenhouse gas emissions. But you might expect then that we'd see renewed or an increased emphasis on energy efficiency within the gas end uses. But we also hear advocates arguing against replacing old gas equipment with new high efficiency gas equipment. They're concerned that even if that looks good in terms of the immediate effect, that it builds in continued use of fossil natural gas, when a better long-term strategy might be to shift that to high efficiency electric equipment. And while we see this economy-wide transformation as a great opportunity for our state, we also see it as a risk to overburdened communities and low-income households, small businesses, tenants, who all could be left behind in the transformation for a lack of ability to pay for this new equipment. And so we think utility and government programs are especially important to make sure that our transformation is an equitable one. So just to sum this up, we are finding, as we broaden our perspective to look at climate objectives, that it is raising new questions about the role of energy efficiency. But we're not sure that we've got all of the math right at this point on some of those questions. But that as we look across the entire economy, it seems quite clear that there's plenty of potential for energy efficiency, including changes in the form of energy that can support both our climate goals and reduce costs for consumers and businesses in our state. So that's kind of the perspective from Washington, and I look forward to our continued discussion of this. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Glenn and Senator McClellan and Dave and Elizabeth. So we're all back here on the dais, virtual dais. I do have a couple of quick questions coming in from the audience, and those of you who do have questions on the audience side, feel free to put them in the chat. So Elizabeth, there's a question here specifically for the city that is about the blockchain managed microgrids effort where they're operating in the city today. Is that something that the mayor's office is engaged in? And any thoughts about key issues on program design and management?
I do think that type of work is handled through our Economic Development Corporation. So I might not be the best person to speak to that, but we are definitely looking at any and all beneficial ways to expand capacity and distributed resources throughout New York City.
Yeah, and I would only add that the Carbon Neutral NYC study did pay a fair amount of attention to district energy, both the utility-owned district energy systems and individual campuses like hospitals and colleges. So I know the city is very focused on trying to build in that kind of capacity where it's there. Second question we have here goes to Glenn, and that is, has a standard been established or societal cost of carbon, or GHGs, for Washington electric efficiency programs? Is there something kind of on the books that someone could look up and presumably perhaps use somewhere else?
There is. Our legislature adopted specific values for the social cost of carbon that are based on the it's the last estimate that was done under the Obama administration. So it's set of numbers that escalates roughly from $50 a ton up to 100, over the years. The methodology for doing that it's been lots of discussion about that within the electric sector in terms of where you apply that adder, and so you could look at any of the integrated resource planning processes of our utilities, and the website for the Utilities and Transportation Commission has the values posted there.
And following up on that briefly, Glenn, so I've seen in a couple of states where when a utility commission is considering adding a social cost of carbon, there's some commenters who say, well, you have to limit the cost of carbon to state borders rather than having a global average or national average cost of carbon. And I wonder, has Washington had to grapple with that issue?
Well, we did before the legislature, established these values in statute. And we started by thinking about it as a risk of a future carbon tax, and let's incorporate that as a probabilistic type cost. And there certainly were arguments about, well, I'm not going to count any cost that's outside of my jurisdiction. But we're past that. It's the global value. We may not have the right global value. It's now, several years, at least 6 since those values were established, and the newer studies would suggest that we're a little low on our numbers, perhaps.
Gotcha. So keep those questions coming from the audience. But I did have a question for Senator McClellan. You mentioned that there was opposition from the energy companies initially, and then they came around. And I'm just wondering, what was that conversation like once it was more collaboration than competition? What were some of the issues that had to be addressed in gaining some level of comfort from the energy supplier side?
I think because the Clean Economy Act had so many different pillars, their initial reaction was just, this is too complicated and we can't do this now. And when they figured out that wasn't going to work, they were very interested in the wind side. And the bill was trying to strike the right balance between reaching 100% clean energy standard while still meeting current demand and managing that demand, but also in a way that the utility companies weren't the only ones providing the renewable energy sources. So a big part of the conversation was, how much of the wind and solar will Dominion provide versus third parties? And I think that was the biggest debate. And it goes back to a comment earlier, and I see one of the questions talking about how traditionally utility companies have made money from building things, building generation projects, and trying to shift the mindset away from that more towards, now we need you to reduce or at least level off energy consumption, was counterintuitive to how they made money. And so I think that was the biggest hurdle, was just shifting the mindset away from, we're just going to build things and not manage demand, and Dominion and APCO, you've got to allow third parties to come in so that we can also use competition in a way to manage the cost of electricity overall.
Great. Yeah, that's really a key set of issues. Like, how do you get stakeholders sufficiently engaged that you can at least get to the point of not throwing the whole tub of bathwater out. So that's important insight. I did want to follow up on a point that Dave, you mentioned in passing, and I believe it was use terms that resonate with the community. And maybe other panelists have views on this, but in my travels, when I go to a party and someone asks me what I do, and I say I work on energy efficiency, and they say, "Oh, you mean is that like solar?" Because there's not a clear way of visualizing what this is. And so Dave, I wonder if you want to start that discussion off. Maybe say a little bit more about what have you found to be effective ways of talking about what is this thing called energy efficiency and how does it fit in? How do you explain that to people who don't live and breathe this every day?
Yeah, I think number one is you have to talk about it, right? We have to talk about climate change. We're really making a big effort to do local climate action planning. And while when we look at our state inventory, it's sort of equally divided between industrial emissions, energy generation emissions, transportation. It's not necessarily that way in folks' communities, right? Depending if they live near a highway or maybe they're more of a bedroom community for a larger city, there's different views that folks have as to what to do to combat climate change. And a lot of times it's what can they do. And so you need to have those conversations, whether it's about buildings, whether it's about transportation, whether it's about residential structures, because folks want to help. But if they think the solutions are too massive, things that they can't contribute to, it's hard for them to relate. I want to go back to something that Glenn said with regards to social cost of carbon. We include that in our climate action planning as well. It's part of how do we identify whether things are cost effective, beyond just the economic return for efficiency on energy use. Well, what it's really about is that it's a measure on does it matter, and I would submit that it all matters. That each piece of this matters. Whether you're sewing a button on a soldier's coat or you're helping to build a tank, it all matters. This is nearly like a war effort. One of the issues we have in Pennsylvania is that we have a lot of pride in Pennsylvania. We had the first oil well, right? Coal and steel powered the World War I and World War II. We have a lot of natural gas in Pennsylvania, and some folks see this as a move on that there's no respect for the energy generation position of Pennsylvania. But I think we have to talk about the respect we need to pay to the climate crisis that we have now, and that we're all in it together, and that there's a piece of this that they can contribute to. Folks want to ultimately contribute to the cause, to the betterment for our future generations. And so I think that that's part of this. That's the conversation we need to have. Not about, we don't like coal anymore, you should be building a bunch of solar. That's not the right conversation. The conversation is what's going on in your community, what things can you contribute to it? Are you sewing a button on a coat or are you building a tank? And understand that it all matters.
I think also you have message and messenger, so they're both really important. And we've seen historically just challenges with trust of the government, trust of the mouthpiece. And so figuring out what the message is, but then making sure that we're reaching those most at risk to climate impacts via their trusted messengers is going to play a really critical role in communities coming together to take on some of these pretty complicated topics. So, working through community organizations, home health aides, weather reporters, faith-based organizations, all of that is going to play a really important part in this transition.
Yeah, important points to be sure. I did want to get also in, we're at our official hour time, but if folks can stay over a few minutes, a couple of you touched on what I consider the electrification versus efficiency challenge, where, in one of the themes we see today is, let's clean up the grid and then let's electrify everything. And I think Glenn and Elizabeth, you both touched on that. I know that in the Carbon Neutral New York study, there was at least one pathway that had a lot of electrification in it. But as you said, to really make that work in terms of not blowing up peak demand on the grid or what have you, you had to go pretty hard on efficiency. So Elizabeth or Glenn in particular, but any of the panelists, any thoughts on how to look at electrification and efficiency in the new emerging scene that we've got?
I could start. We have found that either way, you end up needing to use electricity to come up with the energy in the form that you're going to use it. Because if you don't switch to electric equipment, you end up having to produce synthetic or biogenic fuels, which takes even more energy and almost as much electricity as the directly using electric equipment. So I think as long as you're serious about your emissions reduction goals, electrification is inevitably the best strategy to get there. It doesn't get you all the way there. There are certainly some hard to electrify end uses, and those become challenging, expensive, and that's where you need to focus your limited resources, is on those residual sources of fossil energy.
Yeah, Elizabeth, did you have something to add there?
Yes. Where to start? I mean, energy efficiency is a cornerstone of our work citywide, and from a practical perspective, it's going to lower the cost of electrification. So it's critical, but the challenge is just keeping people's attention on it. For instance, when we passed Local Law 97, which is all about reducing site-based carbon through energy efficiency, industry leaders immediately jumped into conversations about RECs and offsets and carbon trading. And you're like, no, energy efficiency, come back to center. And so just making sure that's part of the narrative, and those leaders are the leaders, and they're always going to be pushing and innovating. But we have a whole lot of people that aren't aware of this message. And so, try to focus a lot of our attention on that education and awareness.
And if I can jump in here, that's part of why we structured the Virginia Clean Economy Act the way that we did. Over the years, we had separate energy efficiency bills, separate solar, separate wind. But we really understood from the beginning it was a three-legged stool, and that if you truly were going to reach 100% clean energy in a way that keeps the lights on and doesn't cause rate shock, that all pieces had to pass together. And we even had some attempts to pull pieces apart, but the critical component for us was making sure that we tied energy efficiency to the clean energy standard, and that we put real targets and consequences for not meeting them on our electric companies, while also empowering the state and groups like the Virginia Poverty Law Center to reach out into communities to build and capture consumer demand for it. So we really understood that you've got to pull every lever to reach your goals to reduce carbon emissions.
Mm. That's a really helpful perspective. I also, I've experienced efficiency and electrification in the same bundle. So when I bought my Nissan Leaf last year, I realized, oh, it's 4 times more fuel efficient than my hybrid RAV4. It's amazing. It's very efficient technology, and we're replacing our HVAC this year. And until 15 years ago, the federal standard was SEER 10 for residential equipment. My contractor is saying, well, would you rather have the SEER 18 or the SEER 20? So there's a lot of efficiency coming through the pipeline that makes, potentially can make electrification a win-win there. But, it's got to all be, as you say, Senator, it's got to be looked at as a whole. One last issue, I want to let folks go a little before we get to the quarter hour. Glenn, I believe you mentioned the need to take another look at how we value energy efficiency. Do we just compare it to avoided generation, or some utilities that I work with are looking at the distribution system value of efficiency, both in time and in space. And so there's some new looks going on there. But I just wonder if anyone, Glenn, if you others have thoughts on how we should be looking at efficiency and the way it's valued, by utility commissions or by state officials in any way.
And I think there's been so much presented at this conference on that question already that I wouldn't try to restate all of that. But we do think that comprehensive approach, just as I think it's important to include greenhouse gas costs on a global basis, that all of the benefits and costs in terms of resilience or improved health for occupants of the building, those should all be incorporated into the analysis. And we need to look at it with our new grid configurations in mind, where flexibility becomes really important for end uses to allow us to adjust for the variable nature of renewable resources. So there's a lot of work for our analysts out there to stay up to speed on the many values of energy efficiency.
You mentioned demand flexibility, and that was one of the things that was modeled in the carbon neutral NYC study, like maintaining dual fuel heating capacity in a percentage of buildings, and also using water heaters as a demand control method. I'm getting a heat pump water heater this year, and I'm finding out that a lot of the manufacturers are already building Wi-Fi connectivity into those products. So essentially you have energy, grid-enabled energy storage, and potentially already sitting there in your base. It's efficient, but it also can be used for grid support, right?
And maybe I will brag a little bit here about the Washington State in 2019 required that as a design element of water heaters. We can't touch the efficiency levels of water heaters. It's federally preempted, but we required as a design element that it have that communication port built in. We've hit a little bit of rough water with some supply chain issues in the last year or so in terms of actually getting the product into the market. But we are very hopeful that that's going to help move the product design nationally, even though we are but a small state in the corner.
All right. Well, I think we have just about beat this particular topic up. We could go on for hours and days, of course, but there are many other sessions left to come in the conference. We do hope those who enjoyed this one will enjoy many others. But thank you to our panelists. This is where, we asked for a big round of applause. Dave, I wish we were in Philadelphia like we planned. Next year, maybe. So a virtual thanks to all the panelists, and we will sign off for now, and hope everyone enjoys the rest of the conference.
All right. Thank you.
Take care all.
Thank you.